Well, I've come around. I wasn't initially blown away with AGX, but in the last couple of weeks I've processed a few images with it, done a lot of reading, and Kofa, the guy who wrote the module, was gracious enough to give me about 90 minutes of his time for a video chat, and we talked through a lot of it. So, in this video, we're going to look into AGX. Let's go. Hi, and welcome to episode 164 of Understanding Darktable. We now have 4 different tone mappers in Darktable. We've got Base Curve, which was the original. We then got Filmic RGB, written by Aurelian Pierre. Then Flannelhead came up with Sigmoid. And now Kofa has come up with AGX, although Kofa would be the first to admit that he's borrowed pretty heavily from the work of the AGX module in a piece of software called Blender. So what exactly is a tone mapper? Well, today's digital camera sensors are capable of 14, 15, even 16 stops of dynamic range when it comes to luminosity, from your deepest shadows to your brightest whites. And that's great because that is equal to and potentially surpassing what our eyes are capable of detecting in the real world. However, 99% of the time, we want to take these images and display them either on a computer monitor, which is sRGB, or on a mobile phone, which is also sRGB. And most of these screens only have 6 stops of dynamic range through to maybe 10 or 12 stops of dynamic range for a really good computer monitor. So somehow we have to be able to take the massive range of data that was captured by the camera sensor and compress it down into a range of luminosities that an sRGB screen, whether it's a computer monitor or your phone, can actually reproduce and still give the same impression of tonal range. We don't want to just clip everything beyond a certain point, whether that's in the shadows end or in the highlights end. We want to be able to just remap everything to fit the smaller dynamic range of the device on which we are viewing it. And this kind of comes back to the whole display referred versus scene referred workflow question that has been kicking around in the Darktable world for a couple of years now, right? Because Adobe Lightroom is still using a display referred workflow, which basically means they take that massive range of data that your camera sensor captures and they throw away, well, they don't throw away, but they remap all of that data into a smaller range that your digital display can actually represent. Hence why it's called a display referred workflow. So it means you've taken this huge range of data, compressed it down, and then you do all your color grading in this compressed space, which, when you think about it, sounds crazy. What Darktable has adopted is the same sort of workflow that video nonlinear editors like DaVinci Resolve have had for years now, of a scene referred workflow where you keep that massive range of data in a large color space for as much of the workflow process as you can. And you only crush it down into the display compatible dynamic range at the point of export. And that makes so much more sense. And as an audio engineer, that absolutely resonates with me, because in the audio world, we've been working like that for 30 odd years since digital came around in the early to mid 90s, where we work with high bitrate audio files all the way through the production process so that we've got the most dynamic range and the best signal to noise ratio, and we only reduce the word length of our audio down to a 16-bit format for MP3 or WAV at the point of delivering the end product. So to me, it all completely makes sense. That's kind of a long-winded answer of what is a tone mapper. It's designed to take this massive range of data and remap it to fit within the constraints of your digital display. So what is the goal with AGX? Well, as Kofa says in his documentation, which I will link to in the show notes down below, things that get brighter in the physical world tend to, or our visual perception of those surfaces is saturation decreases as things get brighter to the point where things become white. Not recommended, but if you look at the sun, when your eyes are sort of off to the side of the sun, you see oranges, and then as you move closer, it becomes a brighter yellow. And the closer you get to actually looking at the sun, again, not recommended, it becomes white. And so the idea of AGX is to try and create this smooth transition from saturated color towards white in the highlights. Now, along with the fantastic documentation that Kofa has written, he's also published a page which has essentially a live demo version of the AGX module in a web page. So you can tweak the sliders, and he has a graphic representation of the color space. So you can actually see how affecting the different parameters will alter the color space that's being used to process the image. I highly recommend that you check out the link to that, which will also be down below, just to have a look at that graphic, because I think that graphic will help some people wrap their heads around what the primaries are doing. Now, before we get into playing with AGX, there is one thing I want to cover that I discovered in Kofa's documentation, and that is, by default, he has designed AGX with two tabs, settings and primaries. But you can alter the appearance of the module and have it display as three tabs, where you have settings and then a tab called curve and then the primaries. In the two-tab default layout, the curve part that would appear on the third tab if you enabled the third column view is included in the settings tab. And the reason he's done this is so that we try and avoid that tab switching conundrum that we ended up with the tone equalizer module, where you have to go to one tab to set the dynamic range, but then you've got to jump back to another tab to actually then tweak the curve. So that was his thinking. But for people who are on limited screen real estate, the three-column view might actually be the better fit. So at the moment, I'm running in the default two-column view here, settings and primaries. But if I fire up my test1 database here, and we jump into this image and we have a look at AGX, I've now got the third column view with the curve on its own column. So yeah, if you've got limited screen real estate, this can be a great option for you. At the risk of making this video an hour-long epic, I will just point you to Kofa's documentation, where he gives you the instructions on how to enable that third column view if you want it. Okay, with all that said, let's dive in and see how AGX actually works. I've got this image that I shot in Brisbane during COVID, and as you can see, I've got my original version, which I finished off with Filmic RGB. I then did a version with Sigmoid when Darktable 4.7 came out, and now I've taken another copy of this image and I will process this with AGX. I suggest you start with the Primaries tab, just so we can get our head around what's going on here. By default, base primaries will use the Rec 2020 color space, and that should be the default working color space for Darktable anyway. So if you were to choose working profile, you'd probably be on Rec 2020 anyway, but you can choose any of these working color spaces to do your processing in. I'm not sure why sRGB is offered, because that would essentially be forcing you into a display referred workflow, which is what we've been trying to avoid for the last few years. So we'll leave that on Rec 2020. You'll notice that the primaries are divided into two sections, before tone mapping and after tone mapping. So the idea here is that we do some attenuation, that is turning down the intensity of the primary colours, red, green and blue, prior to actually doing the tone mapping curve. And then after the tone mapping curve has been applied to our full range data, we then reverse what happened up here with the attenuation and rotation. Now, I will confess, I still don't quite understand why that is. So if we were to set this back to unmodified, all of our attenuation sliders are at 0%. All of our rotation sliders are at 0 degrees. If we crank up the blue attenuation, you will notice the blue moving towards white. And if you go all the way to 99%, then the entire image appears monochrome. The rotation allows us to alter the hue of that particular primary. And you saw that in Kofa's live web page where you can play with those sliders. You can see how the rotation affects the color space. Let's just use one of Kofa's presets here. We'll go blend alike. I'm going to leave the rotation values as per the Blender preset. And then we move down to this bottom section. Now, we can click Set from Above, and what that will do is set the purity boost for the red, the green, and the blue channels to be equal percentages to the attenuation values we had in the before tone mapping section. So in other words, it will precisely undo whatever we did before the tone mapping. So the idea is that we've made these alterations to the color space, we've applied the tone mapping, and then we apply an exact reversal of those primary adjustments after tone mapping to get us back to where we started. Like I said, I don't fully understand the logic behind why that's necessary. It is explained in Kofa's documentation, and I highly recommend you read it. But if you struggle to understand it, trust me, you're not the only one. All right, so I'm going to go Set from Above. And you can see that Master Purity Boost and Master Rotation Reversal are both at 100%. Our Purity Boost values exactly reflect the attenuation values from the before tone mapping section, and the rotation values are the same values, but you will notice that the color order is reversed because we are reversing what we did previously. So, for example, the blue rotation slider has cyan on the left and magenta on the right, but after tone mapping, it's magenta on the left and cyan on the right. I think that's just so that visually the rotation controls are in the same point along the slider. That's my guess. Now you can simply check the reverse all box, and that will mean that you don't need to do anything with the after tone mapping section, because whatever values you put into the before tone mapping section will just automatically be reversed for you. Why is that option there? Because there might be times when you want to move these values away from being the exact reversal of what was done prior to tone mapping. Now that's going to come down to image by image. There will be some images where you'll want to do it. There'll be 1,000 images where you probably won't need to. With all of that said, let's just try taking some snapshots so we can see what these primary attenuation sliders are doing. So I'm going to set the blue attenuation back to 0%, and we will go set from above, and we'll take a snapshot. Now I'm going to set the blue attenuation at, say, 25%, and set from above. What I should do is just hit the reverse all. Why not? And I will take another snapshot, and now I will set this at 50%. And because I've got reverse all, it means the after tone mapping reversals have been applied for me to exactly match what I've done here. So what was the difference? Well, if we go back to where we started, you can see that pretty much everything else in the image remains the same except for the blues. Okay. And with the attenuation slider at 0%, it's like we gave a 2-year-old a paintbrush and said, paint me some blue reflections on the water. Like, it's hideous. It's just big chunks of nasty blue, bleh, right? I mean, maybe you like it. That's fine. You're entitled to like it if you want to. For me, it looks horrible. 50% is probably way too much. If we go to the 25% preset, that takes us to there. So that's 50%, that's 25%. I actually think this is a nice compromise in terms of the smoothness of gradations and tonal variance and that sort of thing. It's smoother than what we were getting with the 0% attenuation. This is just nasty. But it's lacking some colour. So we are now at 25% blue attenuation. Our red and green I'm not really worried about because neither of those are presenting a challenge with this particular image. And we've got the reverse all checked. So we know that after the tone mapping, our primaries are being reversed precisely. So now we jump over to settings. And this is where we have some fun. White relative exposure, just like Filmic RGB, lets you set the white point for your image. Now you can use the eyedropper here, or you can use the auto tune levels, which will also do the black relative exposure as well as the white relative exposure. So let's just do that. Click on that, and it has dialed in 6.27 EV for white relative and minus 19.2 for the black relative. And I've got to say, I'm seeing nice smooth gradation between the deep shadows here in the foreground and the more colourful reflections on the water. I think the black relative exposure is good. I feel like the sky is not crushed into black too much. I'm still seeing a little bit of ambient light in the sky, which I should because I was in a major city at night. All right, pivot relative exposure. If we have a look at Kofa's notes, the pivot relative exposure sets the input value of the pivot point. Now remember, the pivot point, which is the white dot in the middle of the graph, is the point around which you are going to get the most contrast. Everything below that point in terms of luminosity will be made darker to some degree. Everything above that pivot point in terms of luminosity will be made brighter to some degree, all dependent on the other variables that we play with in the module. But the pivot relative exposure is that point around which we are going to make our contrast adjustments. I'm not going to adjust the pivot relative exposure at this point, but I am going to back off the contrast just a touch. That just brings a little more shadow detail back in, and it also eases off the curve for us. Pivot target out point is great for adjusting the brightness of your overall scene after your tone mapping has taken place. So we can do that kind of thing. And again, you can either use the eyedropper and let AGX read the values from your image and take, its best calculated guess at what that value should be, or you can just do it by eye. The contrast slider will, as the name would suggest, adjust the intensity of the S-curve of the contrast. Shoulder power and toe power allow you to independently control the steepness of the curve for either the shoulder, which is the bit north of the pivot point, so your highlights, or the toe, which are all those luminosities below the pivot point, so all of your shadow information. I love that you get separate control of those. That's fantastic. Neither Sigmoid nor Filmic RGB offers that. Then we've got the advanced curve parameters. Shoulder start and toe start will move a couple of extra points onto the curve, and what that does is something very similar to the latitude slider in Filmic RGB. And if you don't remember what the latitude slider did, let's just turn off AGX, turn on Filmic, come over to the look, and latitude allows you to set a range of the midtones that are protected from the tone mapping curve. And that's exactly what it's doing in AGX as well. With Filmic RGB, you used the latitude slider to determine how far apart from each other those 2 points were, and you then used the shadows and highlights balance to move exactly where that range of protected midtones was on the curve. In AGX, it works a little bit differently in that we have an independent shoulder start and a toe start, so you can set that protected range for yourself simply by dialing in both the shoulder start and toe start values if you want to protect some of the mid-range values from being tone mapped. And then we've got a section called Look. I will confess I haven't spent much time with this particular tab, but you can dial in some saturation if you want to bring back a little bit of that color information that we lost by attenuating the primaries. And I really like this. You don't need a whole lot. Like, I reckon 120% would probably be as far as I'd want to push that, because if I go too far, it starts to get back to the 2-year-old with the paintbrush look. And if you go all crazy, it just ends up looking like pixel vomit. But I'm thinking somewhere around 120% looks really nice. We've got nice rich colors. We've got smooth gradation of tone and, the transition between highlight and shadow. It's all just really smooth. I really like it a lot. And if I compare it with either of my other interpretations of this image, so Filmic RGB, yeah, I'm sorry, I don't love that anymore. Sigmoid, admittedly, this is a much brighter look than what I did here. Perhaps if I tried to match the darkness, things might fall apart a little bit, but I'm kind of liking this slightly brighter interpretation. But I just think the transition between saturated color and moving towards white, as we see on the edge of the bridge here, it just feels a lot more natural to me than either of these. Like, look at this on the side of the bridge. Like, ugh, it's just horrible. And Filmic was not a whole lot better, where I find AGX, it just, look, each to their own. I'm not an expert in how these things work. I just know what I like. I said in episode 163 that I wasn't blown away with AGX, and I think it was because I hadn't spent enough time with it. I didn't really understand it. And now that I've come to work with it and understand it a bit more, and having chatted with Kofa, it's really grown on me. I like it a lot. maybe I will just quickly jump into this. This was shot inside the Red Dog Saloon in Juneau, Alaska. And again, I've got this one done with Filmic RGB. Now, this is not LED lighting, obviously. This is neon lighting. I've got this version done with Sigmoid, and I've got this version, which I've done with AGX. Now, straight out of the gate, you will notice that the red of the neon light is not as in your face as my Filmic version, right? Where it's quite a rich pink of that neon light. And it was like that to the eye. Having said that, I don't think I introduced any saturation here. No, I did not. Let's try 120% and see what it looks like. Ooh, I quite like that. And I'm not 100% certain about the preserve hue. It's something to do with the rotation of the primaries. And Kofa did explain it to me, and I thought I had it. I ain't got it. What I would suggest is, if you've got to this stage where you've applied the tone curve and you feel like maybe the hue has shifted somewhat from what you remembered when you took the image, maybe give the preserve hue slider a go and just see if that gets you back to somewhere that feels a little more like, yeah, that's the way I remember it. Your mileage may vary. All right, guys, this is probably a massively long video by now. I've stopped and started 100 times, so I've got no idea what the total runtime is going to be like, but I'm guessing it's probably going to be close on half an hour. So I will leave it there. I hope this has given you some insight into how AGX works and what it's trying to achieve. I feel like it does desaturate things more than maybe what you are used to with either Filmic RGB or Sigmoid. And initially that might be a turn off, but I think once you throw it at some problem images, LED lighting in particular can be very taxing on digital sensors. You get these areas of an image which just turn into these massive blocks of horrible color. Like, I didn't actually show you this, but if I turn off all the tone mapping, that's what the digital sensor captured in the raw file. It looks hideous. And I've got to say, I don't think that the in-camera JPEG, and admittedly, I don't have the in-camera JPEG because I never keep them. But I would lay money that if I could retrieve that JPEG produced out of the camera, it would not look anywhere near as smooth as this. It would probably look more saturated, but I reckon it would look uglier. Anyway, that is AGX. I'm sure you've got 1,000 questions. Kofa will no doubt be watching this video. Kofa, again, mate, thank you for your time to explain the module to me. I really do appreciate that. I won't go into details, but obviously I'm out of hospital. I am still on the mend and it is painful, and the recovery time is probably another 2 to 3 weeks before I'm back to normal. Thank you to everybody on the Darktable unofficial group on Facebook who sent me their well wishes. Thank you. Really do appreciate it. I really did want to just say, look, I've not dropped the ball on the AGX video. It's just things have happened. Okay, guys, questions, comments, sing out down below. Definitely check out Kofa's documentation because he's written up some really great information in that link. And yeah, throw your questions down below, and if I can't answer them, hopefully Kofa will. And I will catch you in the next one.